Imagine being just 6 years old when you're told you'll be marrying a king more than 4 times your age. For little Isabella, this wasn't a fairy tale, it was her reality. Born into nobility, but thrust into a royal nightmare, she would endure years of neglect, betrayal, and humiliation before rising to become one of the most influential and feared women in medieval England. Her story is one of extraordinary resilience, cunning, intelligence, and ultimately, sweet revenge against those who underestimated her. The year was 1308, when 6-year-old Isabella of France stood trembling before the altar, her tiny hand disappearing into the massive grip of King Edward II of England. Nobody asked if she wanted this marriage. Royal daughters were political pawns, and Isabella was France's most valuable chess piece. As the ceremony concluded, the little girl looked up at her new husband, a man of 29, with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't understand then that this moment would shape her destiny in ways nobody could have predicted. The king barely glanced at his child bride, his attention already wandering to his favorite courtier, Piers Gaveston, who stood smirking at the sidelines. That night, while other children her age played with dolls and listened to bedtime stories, Isabella was left alone in an enormous, cold chamber, wondering what would become of her in this strange new country where she didn't speak the language and had no friends. Isabella's early years in the English court were marked by profound loneliness and confusion. Too young to fulfill her duties as a wife, she was essentially an ornamental figure, trotted out for formal occasions, then hurriedly returned to her chambers. Her ladies-in-waiting, all English noblewomen, loyal to the king, reported her every move and word. They didn't hide their disdain for the French princess, mocking her accent and childish ways. Isabella quickly learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to observe everything while revealing nothing. This skill would serve her well in the years to come. Though she was technically queen, she held no real power or influence. King Edward spent little time with his young bride, preferring the company of his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, whom he had made Earl of Cornwall. The king lavished gifts, lands, and affection on Gaveston while neglecting his wife and the affairs of state. English barons grew increasingly resentful of Gaveston's influence, creating a tense political atmosphere that the young queen observed with keen interest. Isabella may have been a child, but she was beginning to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined the royal court. As the years passed, Isabella focused on 2 things: learning English and studying the political landscape around her. By age 12, she spoke the language fluently and had begun building her own network of informants. She noticed how the barons bristled when Gaveston paraded around in royal jewels that should have been hers, and how the people whispered about the king's inappropriate relationship with his favorite. Isabella kept this knowledge close, filing away every slight and insult. Though still a child, she was developing the sharp political mind that would eventually make her formidable. The relationship between Isabella and Edward remained distant and formal. The king appeared at court functions with his queen as tradition demanded, but his heart clearly belonged to Gaveston. Isabella endured public humiliation when Edward gave jewels intended for her to his favorite, who flaunted them proudly. The young queen's cheeks burned with shame, but she maintained her composure, never letting the courtiers see her pain. Behind closed doors, however, she wrote detailed letters to her father, King Philip IV of France, describing her mistreatment. These communications would later prove crucial to her plans. As tensions between Edward and his barons grew over influence, Isabella carefully positioned herself as a potential mediator, gaining the trust of powerful nobles who saw her as a victim of the king's neglect. By 1312, when Isabella was 10 years old, the situation at court had reached a breaking point. The barons, led by the Earl of Lancaster, had forced Edward to send Gaveston into exile multiple times, but the king always found ways to recall his favorite. Isabella watched these power struggles with increasing interest, recognizing an opportunity to improve her own position. When Gaveston returned from his 3rd exile, the barons' patience finally snapped. They captured the royal favorite and executed him without trial, leaving the king devastated and enraged. Isabella, now approaching puberty, offered comfort to her husband, sensing a chance to finally establish a real marriage. Edward, vulnerable in his grief, turned to his young queen for the first time. Isabella's calculated compassion paid off when, shortly thereafter, she became pregnant with their first child. The future Edward III was born in November 1312, when Isabella was just 11 years old. Despite her youth, she had survived childbirth, a dangerous ordeal that killed many adult women and provided England with an heir. Her position at court immediately strengthened, as she was now mother to the future king. The barons who had previously ignored her began to seek her favor, recognizing her growing influence over the emotionally unstable Edward. Isabella, still a child herself, cradled her infant son and understood that he was both her greatest achievement and her most powerful political weapon. The birth of her son changed everything for Isabella. At just 11 years old, she had accomplished her primary duty as queen by providing an heir to the throne. The court that had once dismissed her now had to acknowledge her importance, and even Edward began to show her a measure of respect. Isabella embraced her new role as mother with surprising maturity, insisting on selecting her son's nurses and overseeing his care personally. She understood that her son represented her security and future influence. However, Edward's attention soon wandered again. With Gaveston gone, he found a new favorite in Hugh Despenser, the younger, a nobleman with boundless ambition and a cruel streak that Gaveston had never possessed. As Edward fell under Despenser's influence, Isabella found herself once again pushed aside. The Queen watched with mounting concern as Despenser manipulated the king, accumulating vast estates and power while making enemies of nearly every baron in England. Unlike with Gaveston, Isabella sensed real danger in Despenser's machinations. He wasn't merely a royal favorite but a calculating political operator who saw the Queen as a threat to be neutralized. Isabella gave birth to 3 more children in quick succession: John in 1316, Eleanor in 1318, and Joan in 1321. Each pregnancy strengthened her position, but also left her physically vulnerable. Despenser took advantage of these periods to poison the king's mind against her, suggesting that she was conspiring with the discontented barons. Isabella, now in her late teens, recognized the pattern but bided her time, focusing on raising her children and building alliances with powerful nobles who resented Despenser's influence. By 1321, tensions between the crown and the barons erupted into open conflict, known as the Despenser War. The Queen, now 19, found herself in a precarious position. Publicly, she had to support her husband, but privately, she shared the barons' hatred of the Despensers, both father and son, who had systematically undermined her authority and stolen her lands. When Edward's forces prevailed and the rebellious barons were executed or imprisoned, the Despensers' power reached new heights. Hugh Despenser, the younger, convinced Edward to reduce Isabella's household and income, effectively making her dependent on Despenser for basic necessities. The humiliation was deliberate and cruel. Isabella, once a proud princess of France, now had to beg for funds to clothe herself and her children. In a particularly vicious move, Despenser orchestrated the arrest of Isabella's French servants, claiming they were spies. The Queen watched helplessly as trusted companions who had been with her since childhood were imprisoned or sent back to France. Isolated and stripped of resources, Isabella might have broken, but adversity only hardened her resolve. She maintained a facade of submissive acceptance while secretly corresponding with opponents of the regime who had fled to France. Her brother, now King Charles IV of France, offered support. Increasingly concerned about reports of his sister's mistreatment, Isabella knew that open defiance would be dangerous, so she adopted a strategy of apparent compliance while looking for any opportunity to break free from Despenser's control. That opportunity came in 1325, when a dispute arose between England and France over territories in Gascony. Charles IV demanded that Edward come to France to pay homage for these lands, but the English king, fearing a trap, hesitated. Isabella, now 23, and a seasoned political operator despite her youth, saw her chance. She suggested that she could go to France as Edward's representative to negotiate with her brother. Desperate to resolve the conflict without risking his own safety, Edward agreed. It was a fateful decision that would change the course of English history. Before departing, Isabella knelt before Edward and promised to negotiate faithfully on his behalf. With tears in her eyes that the court interpreted as wifely devotion, she bid farewell to her husband. Only Isabella knew that she had no intention of returning to a life of humiliation under Despenser's thumb. As her ship sailed from Dover in March 1325, the Queen finally allowed herself to smile. After years of enduring abuse and powerlessness, she was returning to her homeland, where she would be treated with the respect due to her royal birth. What neither Edward nor Despenser suspected was that Isabella's diplomatic mission was about to transform into something far more dangerous to their interests, a rebellion. The meek, submissive queen they thought they knew had been an elaborate performance. The real Isabella, intelligent, determined, and burning for revenge, was finally free to act. Isabella arrived in Paris to a hero's welcome. Her brother, King Charles IV, embraced her warmly and listened with growing anger as she recounted her mistreatment at the English court. Publicly, Isabella maintained the fiction that she was there merely to negotiate the Gascony dispute. But privately, she and Charles were plotting something more substantial. The French court was shocked by Isabella's stories of neglect and humiliation. How could the King of England treat a daughter of France with such disrespect? Isabella, now away from English spies, dropped her mask of submission. She dressed magnificently, attended banquets and tournaments, and reminded everyone that she was not just Edward's neglected wife but a French princess of royal blood. In Paris, Isabella reconnected with something she had lost in England, her dignity. Meanwhile, Edward grew increasingly anxious about his wife's extended stay in France. He sent letters demanding her return, but Isabella responded with diplomatic excuses. The Gascony negotiations were complex, she explained. her brother needed further assurances. In reality, she was building a network of allies and gathering resources for what would come next. Edward's desperation grew when he realized he needed his son, the young prince, Edward, to perform the homage to the French king for Gascony as his proxy. Reluctantly, he sent the 12-year-old heir to the throne to join his mother in Paris, unwittingly delivering into Isabella's hands the one person who could legitimize any action against him. When Prince Edward arrived in Paris in September 1325, Isabella embraced her son with genuine joy. The boy had been under Despenser's influence for years, and she was eager to reconnect with him and explain her perspective on the troubles in England. Among the English exiles in Paris was Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who had escaped from the Tower of London after being imprisoned for opposing the Despensers. Tall, charismatic, and as determined to bring down the king's favorites as Isabella was, Mortimer quickly became the queen's closest ally and, soon, her lover. Their relationship scandalized Europe, but Isabella was past caring about conventional morality. After years of rejection and humiliation from her husband, she had found a man who valued her intelligence and shared her political goals. Together, they began planning an invasion of England to overthrow Edward and the Despensers. Isabella knew that as a woman, even a queen, she couldn't lead an army without a male partner, and Mortimer provided both military expertise and emotional support. Their relationship wasn't just a romance. It was a powerful political alliance. News of the Queen's affair eventually reached Edward, who was furious but still seemingly oblivious to the real danger brewing across the Channel. He sent increasingly threatening letters demanding that Isabella return to England with their son. When she refused, Edward confiscated her properties and declared her a rebel. This only strengthened Isabella's resolve. With nothing left to lose in England, she now had every reason to fight back. By declaring her a rebel, Edward had inadvertently freed her to become exactly that. The king's short-sightedness extended to finance as well. He continued sending Isabella's allowance to France, essentially funding the very rebellion being planned against him. Isabella used these funds to build alliances with continental rulers who had their own reasons to support a change in English leadership. Isabella and Mortimer faced a significant challenge. Raising an invasion force, Edward might be unpopular, but attacking an anointed king was still considered sacrilege. Isabella solved this problem with a brilliant political maneuver. She arranged for her son, Prince Edward, to be engaged to Philippa of Hainault, daughter of the Count of Hainault in Holland. As part of the marriage negotiations, the Count agreed to provide ships and mercenaries for an invasion of England. Isabella further legitimized her cause by declaring that she wasn't seeking to depose her husband, merely to free him from the evil influence of the Despensers. This narrative of a devoted wife and mother trying to save her husband from corrupt advisors resonated with many who might otherwise have opposed her. It was a masterclass in medieval propaganda. As preparations for invasion continued, Isabella commissioned a banner for her army. It depicted her as a widow, suggesting that with Edward under Despenser's control, she was effectively husbandless. The symbolism wasn't subtle, and it sent a clear message about her view of her marriage. In private, Isabella and Mortimer made plans for what would happen after a successful invasion. The Queen was determined that Hugh Despenser would pay for his cruelty toward her, while Mortimer focused on retrieving his confiscated lands and power. Their personal motivations aligned perfectly with their political goals, making them a formidable team. On September 24, 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed at Orwell in Suffolk with a small force of mercenaries. They had gambled everything on the assumption that the English people and nobility would rally to their cause rather than defend an unpopular king and his hated favorite. The gamble paid off spectacularly. As Isabella marched inland, nobles and commoners alike flocked to her banner. Edward and the Despensers, realizing the danger too late, fled London for the west, hoping to raise support in Despenser's Welsh strongholds. They found few willing to fight for them. The king, who had ignored his people's suffering for years, now discovered that they had no loyalty to offer in his hour of need. Isabella pursued her husband with growing confidence, her army swelling with each passing day. She issued proclamations in her son's name, declaring their intention to free the realm from oppression and misgovernment. Towns opened their gates to her, and even London, usually loyal to the crown, welcomed the Queen and proclaimed Prince Edward as guardian of the realm. Isabella's invasion had transformed into a revolution, and it had happened with remarkably little bloodshed. The speed of Edward's collapse revealed just how hollow his power had become under Despenser's influence. By November, Edward and the Despensers had been captured in Wales. The king was imprisoned, while Hugh Despenser, the younger, faced immediate justice. Isabella insisted on being present for his trial, watching with cold satisfaction as the man who had tormented her for years was condemned to a traitor's death. Hugh Despenser's execution was public, elaborate, and extraordinarily brutal, reflecting the depth of hatred he had inspired. First, he was dragged through the streets of Hereford, tied to 4 horses. Then he was hanged from a gallows 50 feet high, but cut down while still alive. Still conscious, he was forced to watch his executioners cut off his genitals and internal organs, which were burned before his eyes. Finally, his heart was cut out, and his body was beheaded and quartered. Isabella watched the entire spectacle. Without flinching, the woman who had endured years of humiliation at Despenser's hands showed no mercy to her fallen enemy. Some chroniclers claimed to see satisfaction in her expression, earning her the nickname She-Wolf of France in later histories. With Despenser eliminated, Isabella still had to decide what to do with her husband. Edward II remained king by divine right, and deposing an anointed monarch was unprecedented. Isabella and her supporters convened a parliament in January 1327, which formally deposed Edward II in favor of his son. Prince Edward, now 14, was crowned as Edward III on February 1, 1327. Isabella stood proudly at her son's coronation. Having accomplished what few thought possible, she had overthrown a king and placed her son on the throne. For a woman who had arrived in England as a powerless 6-year-old bride, it was an astonishing reversal of fortune. With her son on the throne, Isabella established herself as regent alongside Mortimer. Together, they ruled England, reversing many of Edward II's unpopular policies and rewarding their supporters with lands and titles. Isabella reclaimed her confiscated properties and secured vast estates for herself, becoming one of the wealthiest individuals in England. The former child bride, who had once begged for household funds, now controlled the royal treasury. She dressed in magnificent gowns, wore the finest jewels, and enjoyed all the privileges of power that had been denied to her for so long. However, the problem of Edward II's continued existence troubled the new regime. While imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, the former king remained a potential rallying point for opposition. In September 1327, it was announced that Edward II had died of natural causes. Few believed this convenient explanation. Rumors spread that he had been murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders, possibly in a particularly gruesome manner to avoid leaving marks of violence on his body. According to the most infamous account, his assassins inserted a red-hot poker through a horn into his bowels. Whether Isabella directly ordered her husband's murder remains one of history's unresolved questions. The queen, who had once claimed to be saving her husband from evil advisors, now stood implicated in his death. This dark shadow would eventually return to haunt her, but for the moment, Isabella's power seemed secure and complete. Isabella and Mortimer's regency lasted for 3 years, during which they effectively ruled England in young Edward III's name. Initially popular for removing the hated Despensers, their regime gradually began to mimic the worst aspects of the previous administration. Mortimer accumulated lands and titles, creating resentment among other nobles similar to what the Despensers had inspired. Isabella, perhaps hardened by her years of mistreatment, showed little restraint in rewarding herself for her triumph. The couple negotiated a humiliating peace with Scotland that many English nobles considered shameful, further damaging their popularity. Isabella seemed blind to the growing discontent, confident in her position as the king's mother and regent. Perhaps power, after being denied it for so long, was too intoxicating for her to exercise with moderation. The young Edward III, however, was not the passive child his mother and Mortimer assumed him to be. As he approached 18, he grew increasingly frustrated with his limited role. He had a keen political mind, inherited perhaps from his mother, and had been carefully observing how Mortimer had marginalized him while claiming to rule in his name. Edward also heard the whispers about his father's likely murder, creating a complicated relationship with his mother. He loved Isabella and understood why she had rebelled against his father, but he couldn't condone regicide or accept his own continued powerlessness. Secretly, the young king began building alliances with nobles who resented Mortimer's dominance, planning to take back control of his kingdom. On October 19, 1330, the 18-year-old Edward III struck, while Isabella and Mortimer were staying at Nottingham Castle. Edward and his supporters entered through a secret tunnel. They captured Mortimer in the queen's bedchamber. Despite Isabella's famous plea, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," her words fell on deaf ears. Edward III had decided to assume full control of his kingdom, and Mortimer stood in his way. The man who had helped Isabella overthrow her husband was now condemned to a traitor's death. Mortimer was hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal, ending Isabella's 3-year period of dominance. For Isabella, then 28, this reversal must have been devastating. In a single night, she lost both her lover and her political power. However, Edward III did not treat his mother with the cruelty she might have expected. Perhaps remembering her own suffering under Edward II and the Despensers, he showed remarkable restraint. Isabella was removed from power, and her vast estates were initially confiscated, but she was not imprisoned or publicly humiliated. Instead, she was retired to Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she lived in comfortable seclusion. Her income, though reduced, remained substantial enough to maintain a lifestyle befitting a dowager queen. The she-wolf had been defanged, but not destroyed. Edward visited his mother regularly at Castle Rising, suggesting that their relationship, though complicated by the events surrounding his father's deposition and death, was not beyond repair. Isabella lived for 28 more years after her fall from power, far longer than her period of active political influence. Initially, she may have experienced her confinement at Castle Rising as a punishment, but over time, it became a peaceful retirement. Edward III gradually returned many of her properties, and by 1336, she had recovered much of her former wealth, if not her political influence. Isabella's later years were characterized by religious devotion, perhaps seeking atonement for her role in her husband's downfall and death. She became increasingly pious, spending hours in prayer and making generous donations to religious institutions. The former queen who had once orchestrated an invasion now focused on preparing her soul for judgment. Isabella maintained relationships with her children, particularly her daughters, and took pleasure in watching Edward III develop into one of England's greatest monarchs. She must have felt some pride knowing that she had placed him on the throne, even if he had ultimately pushed her from power. As she aged, Isabella's legendary beauty faded, but visitors to Castle Rising still reported encountering a woman of dignity and intelligence. She followed political developments with interest, occasionally offering advice to her son when he visited, though she was careful never to overreach. Isabella had learned the hard lesson that in medieval England, a woman's power was always conditional, and often temporary. In her final years, Isabella chose to take the habit of the Poor Clares, a Franciscan order known for its austerity. Though she didn't fully enter the convent, this spiritual turn represented a dramatic transformation for a woman who had once been known for her love of luxury and power. It's tempting to see this as evidence of remorse, but Isabella's true thoughts died with her. On August 22, 1358, Isabella of France died at Castle Rising at the age of 63, an impressive age for the medieval period. Per her request, she was buried in her wedding gown, with Edward II's heart in a casket placed on her chest. This final gesture has puzzled historians for centuries. Was it an act of reconciliation, of repentance, or a final claim of possession? Perhaps it was Isabella's way of acknowledging that despite everything, her identity had been shaped by her marriage to Edward, for better or worse. Edward III arranged an elaborate funeral for his mother at the Franciscan Church at Newgate, in London. The ceremony was attended by the highest nobles in the land, a testament to Isabella's enduring importance, despite her years in retirement. Edward's respect for his mother in death suggests that he had come to terms with her complex legacy. Isabella of France, the child bride who became a revolutionary queen, had completed her extraordinary journey. The 6-year-old girl who had trembled before her adult husband had, through intelligence and determination, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to become one of the most consequential women in English history. Isabella's legacy is complicated by the centuries of primarily male historians who have judged her harshly, focusing on her affair with Mortimer and her alleged role in Edward II's murder, rather than the circumstances that drove her to rebellion. She has been portrayed as an adulteress, a she-wolf, and a vindictive woman who betrayed her marriage vows. Only in recent decades have historians begun to reassess Isabella's life with more nuance. Considering the limited options available to a medieval queen facing an ineffective husband and hostile court, modern perspectives tend to emphasize Isabella's political acumen and resilience in the face of extraordinary challenges. The fact that she successfully invaded England and deposed a king, something no other queen consort has ever accomplished, in English history speaks to her exceptional abilities and determination. Her rule with Mortimer, though ultimately unsuccessful, implemented several effective policies and restored stability after years of misgovernment. Had they shown more moderation in their personal accumulation of wealth and power, they might have ruled successfully for much longer. Isabella's most lasting achievement was positioning her son to become one of England's most successful monarchs. Edward III's 50-year reign brought military glory through the early victories of the 100 Years' War and significant constitutional developments. Without Isabella's courage in breaking free from the Despencer's control and fighting for her son's birthright, Edward might never have had the opportunity to become the king he was. The story of Isabella of France from child bride to queen, rebel, regent, and finally, contemplative retiree encapsulates many of the contradictions and constraints of medieval queenship. She wielded extraordinary power at certain moments, but remained vulnerable to the shifting political winds. She was both victim and victimizer, powerless and powerful, devoted mother and alleged regicide. These contradictions make her one of history's most fascinating queens. Isabella's life raises important questions about women's agency in highly patriarchal societies. When traditional avenues of power were closed to her, she created her own path, leveraging her royal birth, her motherhood, and even her sexuality to achieve her goals. While her methods might not align with modern feminist ideals, her refusal To accept the passive role assigned to her resonates across the centuries. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Isabella's story is that she survived it all. Many medieval queens with far less tumultuous lives died young from childbirth, complications, or political intrigue. Isabella not only survived but lived too old, age outlasting most of her contemporaries and enemies. She watched her son's England prosper and her grandchildren grow to adulthood. The scared 6-year-old bride who seemed destined for a life of submission ended her days as a venerated dowager queen with the respect of the realm. In defying the limitations of her time, Isabella of France carved out a place in history that continues to captivate and challenge us today.